Hi everyone, it's Lisa here. I'm back today with another project. I'm going to be watercolouring this card for you today. It's using a couple of stamp sets from Hero Arts, and I'm going to also be using my Kuretake Gansai Tambi watercolour paints. So the two stamp sets that I'm using are the hand-drawn Snowflakes bold print stamp, which is a background stamp that I absolutely love. And this stamp set here, I'm just going to use the sentiment from it. This is the Holiday Petals and Leaves. So in order for me to stamp my background, I'm going to remove the pad from the Misty. That gives me extra dimension to put the stamp in, as it's quite a thick stamp. So I'm giving it a coating of Versamark ink, and I'm being quite generous with that. So I want to make sure that I get a really good impression. I am using a watercolour cardstock, so I'm making sure that I press down really firmly, and I use that scratch paper to help me to get a good impression. Now, I did actually prepare my panel with an anti-static powder before I applied the Versamark ink and now the embossing powder. You must always do that first because that prevents you getting any stray powder. So once I've put the powder on, I'm just going to heat set this with my heat tool. I make sure that it's really hot before I bring it to the paper. So I'm just going to start on the watercolouring now. And what I've done is I've taped my panel down using low tack masking tape onto a clipboard. I mean, I'm not actually going to be picking it up and down, but it does just help it stay in one place and stop moving around on my surface. So I've picked 3 paints from my palette. There's a light, a very kind of light minty green, a denim-y blue, and then a much darker blue. So at the moment I'm just going to add these on. I'm being not very particular about the colours and where they go. At this stage I just want to lay down some colour. Now I am using the wet on wet technique, so you will have seen me lay down a coating of clean clear water right at the start, and I was quite generous with that. I wanted to make sure that I had enough on my paper to be able to add several colours and quite a lot of colour in my first layer. So I'm concentrating really on adding the darker colour around the outside and trying to keep the lighter colours to the middle, but I am mixing them up because I do want to have some variation. Now I end up doing about 3 layers on this panel, and I heat set my layers in between. If I had time, I'd let them dry naturally because you always get a better look if you do that, but I wanted to speed up the process, so I was using a heat gun to dry them in between, and I'm just adding more and more colour on after each layer, but concentrating the dark to the outside and the lighter colours to the centre. And as I say, it often doesn't look like much while you're painting. I think watercolour really comes alive when you actually cut it up and you mount it onto a panel. So whilst that's drying, I'm actually going to let the final layer dry naturally. I'm going to work on my sentiment. So I've taken a small piece of Nina Solar White cardstock, and I'm going to double stamp my sentiment using VersaFine Onyx Black. And I often use this ink for my sentiments. It's a really crisp black, and it's also great if you want to heat emboss it as well, which is what I'm going to do, just to add a little bit of interest. So I'm taking some powder from Hero Arts. This is a clear embossing powder, and I did prepare my little sentiment panel first with an anti-static powder just to make sure there was no sticking. Applied my powder, and I'm now going to heat set that. Rather than just adhere my sentiment panel directly onto my watercoloured panel, I'm going to pop it up on some vellum. So I've cut a small square of vellum. I just think it adds a really nice touch to the back of your sentiment. You don't want to detract from the watercolour, but it just adds something adds a little bit more interest to the back of the sentiment. So I'm just trimming off the edges from the panel. It already looks better once you tidy it up, and I'm going to pop my sentiment down onto the panel. I've got some double-sided foam tape on the back of that, but I realised that I hadn't put any foam tape on the back of my watercolour panel, so I'm just going to add that and adhere it to my base card. And apologies for my head getting in the way here. It's always really tricky to do this bit with the camera on because you have to get right over it. So I'm now going to pop my sentiment on and just press it down firmly. Lastly, I'm just going to add some sequins onto the panel just for a little bit of extra bling. They're quite hard to see on camera, but you can actually see them quite well on the card. When you turn them into the light, they twinkle, so it is a nice extra touch. I'm just using some wet adhesive to adhere those onto the panel. These are Studio Katia Majestic Fusion sequins, one of my favourites. So that finishes my card today. I hope that you like it, and I hope that you'll give some watercolouring a go. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be back soon with another project.